There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease.
Behind the heavily guarded and ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle, a profound and heavy silence had settled over the private quarters, a stillness so absolute that it seemed to amplify the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Princess Catherine sat on the edge of a velvet-upholstered chair, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a single sheet of paper containing the official medical summary that had just been brought down from the royal doctors. Her breath hitched in her throat, and despite her years of rigorous royal training in maintaining absolute public composure, she could no longer hold back the hot tears that began to spill over her cheeks and stain the clinical wording on the page. Standing just a few feet away, near the heavy oak door that separated their private grief from the bustling corridors of palace aides, Prince William stood, watching his wife, his own face a mask of tight, suppressed torment. He had intentionally brought her to this secluded sitting room, far from prying eyes and whispers of court officials, knowing that the constitutional shockwave about to hit the monarchy would first demand a devastating personal toll on the woman he loved. The words written on the paper were clear, controlled, and utterly brutal in their implications. Buckingham Palace was preparing to confirm to the world that King Charles's battle with cancer had reached a tragic and definitive turning point. His ongoing treatments were no longer producing the expected results, and doctors had ordered an immediate, indefinite suspension of all his public and constitutional duties. For Catherine, the realization went far deeper than a mere institutional crisis or the reshuffling of royal calendars, as she read the final paragraph twice, trying to process the reality that the man who had been a pillar of support during her own recent health battles was now facing his final chapter. She lowered the page to her lap, her voice barely a whisper as she reminded William of how his father had promised to remain strong, to guide them through the turbulent transitions of the modern monarchy, and to shield them from the immense pressures of the crown for just a little while longer. William moved toward her, his boots clicking softly against the polished floorboards. But before he could offer word of comfort, Catherine covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking as the sheer weight of what lay ahead finally broke her resolve. William felt a rising wave of panic and dread grip his own chest, yet he forced his posture to remain rigid and steady, knowing with absolute certainty that in this terrifying moment, she needed him to be a supportive husband before the British Empire demanded him to stand as their future king. The silence in the room deepened, growing suffocatingly heavy as William quietly revealed a detail that the upcoming public announcement would intentionally hide from the press and the global public. He explained that in a private, recorded medical briefing meant strictly for the immediate family. The king's chief physicians had explicitly warned them to prepare for sudden, drastic, and highly unpredictable changes in the sovereign's condition. While Charles remained fully conscious and legally capable at this exact moment, the medical team could no longer guarantee how quickly his physical stability might collapse, turning their current state of controlled anxiety into absolute dread. William then shared a second, even more distressing detail that had been passed down directly from the monarch's private secretary just moments before the announcement was scheduled to go live. King Charles had specifically requested to see his eldest son and Princess Catherine separately in his private chambers before the sun set over the Windsor estate, a deliberate and chillingly final command that made it explicitly clear this meeting would cover matters far more permanent than a mere adjustment of treatment plans. Catherine wiped the tears from her tear-stained face, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and sudden apprehension as she looked up at her husband and asked if Queen Camilla had been made aware of this specific request. William hesitated for a long, painful moment before shaking his head, admitting that while the Queen Consort had certainly been informed about the sharp decline in her husband's physical health, she was entirely unaware of what Charles intended to discuss in those exclusive, closed-door meetings with the direct heirs. This deliberate omission carried an immediate and volatile danger, threatening to fracture the fragile peace within the senior ranks of the family before the public even learned of the king's deterioration. Catherine's emotional breakdown was merely the first visible crack in the palace's carefully constructed facade, because behind the formal language of the impending medical announcement stood a real family facing ancient promises, unyielding duties, and monumental life shift that none of them were emotionally prepared to inherit to the global public. King Charles was a sovereign whose medical condition had suddenly taken a turn for the worse, but to those living within the palace walls, he was a father, a husband, a grandfather, and the central gravity holding together a complex web of deeply fragile relationships. As the hour of the scheduled sunset meeting approached, Catherine gathered what remained of her strength, smoothed down her garments, and walked down the long, carpeted corridors toward the king's private suite, determined to offer him comfort rather than her own despair. When she entered the dimly lit room, she tried to step as quietly as possible, but Charles, sitting propped up by pillows in a large armchair, noticed a redness in her eyes immediately and attempted to ease the heavy atmosphere with a faint, self-deprecating joke about his current state. However, the raspy weakness in his once commanding voice only made the moment infinitely more painful for Catherine, triggering vivid memories of how he had frequently called her during her own dark days of illness, speaking not as an intimidating monarch, but as a tender father who understood the paralyzing grip of health fears. He had been the one who fiercely kept the overwhelming palace pressures away from her when the public's expectations grew too heavy to bear, and that past protection mattered immensely now, because she was no longer looking at a distant head of state. She was looking at the vulnerable man who had once shielded her. Charles reached out a pale, trembling hand toward her, his voice softening as he gently instructed her not to cry in his presence, prompting Catherine to force a brave smile even as his fragile fingers shook weakly against her palm. She lowered her head, holding his hand with both of her own as if she could physically transfer her strength into his failing body, completely unwilling to let him sense just how utterly terrified she had truly become about the looming future. The king watched her face closely, his eyes reflecting a deep, sorrowful awareness that the intense pain she was feeling was tied not only to his failing health, but to the crushing demands that his inevitable decline would now place upon William's shoulders. William was already carrying a suffocating psychological burden that he could never openly admit to the public or his closest aides, facing the agonizing reality of losing his father while simultaneously preparing to inherit a crown that would instantly reshape his marriage, his children's daily lives, and his entire relationship with the world. The position of direct heir, which had once seemed like a distant constitutional theory, now felt like a sharp blade hanging over every single private conversation and family dinner they shared, threatening to consume his identity. He desperately wanted to remain just a grieving son comforting a sick parent, but the massive palace machinery was already shifting gears around him, treating him with the cold, calculated deference reserved exclusively for a future king. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla waited anxiously in an adjoining reception room, her knuckles turning white as she tightly gripped the upholstered arm of her chair, watching with growing unease as senior palace officials and medical staff moved briskly between Charles's bedroom and William's office. As the queen consort, a position that required her to provide unwavering personal support to the monarch without actually holding any independent constitutional power, she could feel monumental decisions forming entirely beyond her reach, and she deeply feared that every closed door would systematically reduce her standing and security beside him. Charles was fully aware that his wife was waiting right outside, yet he deliberately chose not to call her into the room, choosing instead to keep this pivotal conversation focused strictly on the line of succession, compounding the emotional crisis. Catherine had spent the last several days desperately trying to shield young Prince George from the full, terrifying truth of his grandfather's condition, fearing that revealing too much would force the young boy to grasp the cold realities of royal succession before he was emotionally mature enough to handle them. William had fully agreed with this protective strategy, but they both knew that the heavy silence pervading the palace could not be maintained forever as staff members began whispering in the hallways. It was during this tense, quiet exchange that William's eyes fell upon the locked, iconic red leather dispatch box sitting on a small table directly beside Charles's bed. The secure case used daily for official government papers and highly confidential royal instructions. Inside that box lay separate, sealed legal and personal directions written by Charles for William, Catherine, Camilla, and Princess, and documents that would dictate the immediate path of the monarchy. Charles finally cleared his throat and spoke with quiet authority, stating that he explicitly wanted Catherine to remain present during a highly sensitive conversation that was traditionally reserved solely for the reigning sovereign and the direct male heir. William looked at his wife, their eyes locking in a moment of shared realization. Both understood the uncharted and perilous territory their family had just entered. They had walked into the room believing they were simply gathering to comfort a sick family member, but King Charles was preparing to reveal that his secret physical decline had already forced him to fundamentally reshape the immediate future of the British monarchy. The atmosphere within the king's private chamber grew intensely suffocating as Prince William slowly approached the bedside, his eyes fixed on the historic red, leather dispatch box that held the immediate future of the British Empire. King Charles gestured with a weak movement of his chin for his son to sit down, while Princess Catherine remained standing close by, her hand still resting near the official papers as a silent anchor of emotional support. The king did not waste time with administrative pleasantries, acknowledging that the sudden collapse during the family lunch at Windsor had stripped away any remaining ability to hide his rapidly accelerating physical decline. He confessed that for the past several weeks, he had been deliberately concealing the full extent of his exhaustion, masking periods of severe disorientation and sudden physical weakness from both his family and the senior courtiers who managed his grueling daily schedule. To Catherine, this revelation explained the heavy, unspoken tension that had been building behind the palace walls, illuminating why the monarch had been fighting so fiercely to maintain a public facade of unshakable strength. Charles explained that the royal advisors, working in absolute secrecy alongside constitutional lawyers, had already drafted an emergency framework to immediately transfer a massive portion of his state responsibilities directly to William. These critical tasks included the formal granting of royal assent to government legislation, conducting urgent audiences with foreign diplomats, and signing high-level state documents that required the immediate authority of the sovereign. However, the real emotional fault line in the room emerged when the king explicitly detailed a unique role he had carved out specifically for Catherine in these sealed, confidential instructions. He explained that as William absorbed the overwhelming political and constitutional burdens of the crown, Catherine must serve as the primary emotional bridge holding the fractured family together, navigating the deep anxieties of Queen Camilla, the logistical demands of Princess Anne, and the protection of the young royal children. Outside the heavy oak doors, the faint sound of footsteps signaled that the palace machinery was moving at an unstoppable pace, erasing months of scheduled public engagements and reassigning royal staff members around the expanding diary of the direct heir. Yet, inside the bedroom, the immediate danger was deeply personal, driven by the volatile reality that Queen Camilla had been intentionally excluded from this specific gathering. Catherine voiced a profound concern, warning that bypassing the queen consort during such a monumentally historic shift in power would inevitably breed deep suspicion and resentment, turning their private family grief into a toxic struggle for internal control. William's expression hardened, his internal conflict raw as he openly admitted the profound guilt he felt, confessing that a part of him had spent his entire life training to inherit the throne. Yet he now felt an overwhelming sense of shame and betrayal for organizing the transition while his father was still actively fighting for his survival. The tension reached a breaking point just moments later, when the heavy doors opened and Queen Camilla entered the room, her elegant composure completely shattered by the realization that historic decisions were being finalized entirely without her input. She did not approach Catherine as a reigning queen enforcing rigid palace protocol, but rather as a deeply terrified wife who felt her decades-long struggle for security and position beside her husband systematically slipping away in a single afternoon. Camilla instantly accused Catherine of becoming far too deeply involved in high-level constitutional arrangements that belonged strictly to the sovereign and his immediate spouse, warning that public sympathy could easily be manipulated into political influence that would permanently alter the family dynamic. Catherine refused to back down, her tears hardening into absolute resolve as she stepped closer to the queen consort, fiercely stating that she desired absolutely no authority gained through family suffering and would gladly surrender every new responsibility if it could somehow restore the king's failing health. She reminded Camilla that these specific arrangements were documented directly under Charles's personal commands, recorded explicitly, so that no one could later twist his final wishes or create false rivalries among those left behind. The argument was abruptly silenced by the king himself, who raised a trembling hand and demanded absolute unity, signing the official reduction of his duties right before their eyes and firmly establishing that the shift in power came for his own conscious choice, not from internal pressure or ambition. As the reality of the signed document settled over the room, Princess Anne arrived, her characteristically sharp eyes taking an emotional wreckage before quietly reading the new constitutional arrangement. She removed her glasses and looked toward her brother's empty chair, stating with chilling clarity that Charles would never have authorized such a massive transfer of authority unless the immediate medical danger was absolute and irreversible. Her words left a haunting silence in the room, forcing both William and Camilla to face the brutal reality that the sound of a single turning page had marked the definitive point of no return for the modern monarchy. Charles then turned his gaze back to Catherine, whispering that her emotional breakdown earlier had not shown weakness, but had instead revealed the vital, raw humanity that the cold institution of the crown must never be allowed to lose. He apologized to William for the prolonged silence surrounding his health, admitting that by trying to protect his son from the truth, he had actually placed a far heavier psychological burden on his shoulders. Father and son shared a rare, silent embrace that broke through decades of formal royal restraint. While Catherine and Camilla stood side by side, their mutual suspicions slowly dissolving into a shared, quiet grief as they realized they were both watching the central anchor of their lives slowly disappear behind the rigid, unyielding machinery of state duty. As the pale light of morning began to creep through the towering windows of Windsor Castle, the private emotional storm that had consumed the family overnight was suddenly forced to confront the harsh, unyielding reality of the outside world. The official announcement from Buckingham Palace had been live for less than an hour, but its impact was already vibrating across breakfast tables, crowded railway platforms, and silent television studios throughout the entire country. Outside the massive iron gates of the palace, the heavy atmosphere of national turning point was palpable as hundreds of citizens began to gather in complete silence, bringing with them vibrant bouquets of flowers, handwritten notes of encouragement, and old photographs from the king's coronation. One particular image captured the hearts of the national broadcasters who had suspended their regular programming to cover the crisis. A young girl, accompanied by her mother, stepped forward to place a simple, handwritten card against the stone railings that read, "Thank you, King Charles. Please keep fighting." Inside the palace walls, the royal standard, the flag indicating the presence and authority of the sovereign, hung heavily against the gray sky, its traditional symbolism now carrying a profound psychological weight that went far beyond mere historical ceremony. Palace officials quickly released a secondary medical statement to contain the exploding public speculation, confirming that while the king remained fully conscious and surrounded by his immediate family, he would be completely withdrawing from public view to focus entirely on his treatment and rest. For William and Catherine, the private promise they had made to each other on the sitting room floor hours earlier was now put to its very first public test as they prepared to step out for a brief, highly anticipated appearance beside the gathered crowds. Catherine's eyes remained visibly strained from the hours of weeping, yet as she stood shoulder to shoulder with the prince, she forced herself to channel every ounce of her royal training to project a sense of unshakable continuity. When a voice from the crowd shouted out that the entire nation was standing firmly with his father, William paused, lowering his head for a brief moment as the sheer magnitude of his new reality pressed down on him. But Catherine instantly tightened her fingers around his hand, silently reminding him that he was no longer carrying this historic burden alone. Back inside the private quarters, King Charles watched the live television broadcast from his armchair, a faint, proud smile touching his lips as he witnessed his son and daughter-in-law facing the public scrutiny not as isolated individuals, but as an inseparable, equal partnership. Recognizing that the family could not survive the coming months if they remained divided by unspoken fears and buried resentments, the monarch summoned William, Catherine, Camilla, and Princess, and for one final, definitive gathering in his private study. He spoke to them without the stiff constraints of ceremonial language, explicitly stating that while he could not alter the medical verdict delivered by his doctors, he had the absolute power to decide how his family would respond to it. Charles looked directly at Catherine and firmly told her that her visible breakdown the day before had not been a display of institutional weakness, but had instead revealed the authentic, raw humanity that the crown must always fight to preserve if it wished to remain relevant to the people. He then turned to Queen Camilla, publicly reaffirming that her position as his wife and closest personal companion remained completely secure, ensuring that the expansion of the younger royal's duties would never diminish her standing or strip away her hard-earned security. In a deeply moving gesture of reconciliation that shattered months of internal court politics, Catherine crossed the quiet room and gently took Camilla's hand, a silent vow of solidarity that the queen consort accepted with tears in her own eyes, effectively ending the volatile rivalry that threatened to tear the palace apart from within. Charles then revealed that he had recorded a final, personal audio statement to be kept within the family archive, a poignant message urging them to never let the cold, demanding machinery of state duty destroy the warmth, honesty, and mutual trust that had defined their private lives. As the meeting drew to a close and William moved toward the exit, Charles called him back for one last, deeply emotional embrace between a father and a son, stripping away the titles of king and prince to leave only two men bound by love and an immense, shared destiny. Princess Catherine's breakdown had exposed the profound human cost hidden behind the glamour of the British monarchy, but through that very vulnerability, King Charles had successfully transformed their collective terror into a unified, historic purpose, ensuring that while the institution would be permanently changed, its heart will remain unbroken.